All righty. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this exciting webinar where we're going to talk about the new OSRA ruling, OSRA 2022 final rule on detention and demurrage invoicing requirements. Such an exciting topic. Are you ready? My name is Akshay Dadeja. I am the co-founder and CEO of Terminal49. I have the pleasure of having Dan Gardner, who's the co-founder, EVP and Chief Learning Officer at Trade Accelerators. He'll give a brief introduction about what he does shortly. Before we get started, we've been very surprised. We thought this was an interesting topic, interesting enough that Dan and I spent last couple of days digging through this 30-page ruling, which is quite dense to read. And our focus today is really an FYI. And what is this ruling about? How does it affect the logistics world, specifically BCOs, cargo owners, logistics service providers, marine terminals, carriers, and VOCCs. So we'll dig into all of those bits and pieces of information and really come out with how can we get practical and as this rule goes into effect on May 28th. Just a reminder, you have your chat function and Q&A. Feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. This is really an open-ended conversations. We are here to share some of our findings, but we really want to engage you all and answer your questions. If we don't get to answer all the questions, we will answer the questions at the end of the webinar in an email and send everybody a summary of the Q&A as well as the responses that we can answer to our best. There's still a lot of unknowns here. There's still a lot of messiness and fuzziness with this ruling. And we are as curious as you might be on what this means for you and the greater logistics industry. All right, let's dive in. So today's agenda is briefly we'll talk about who we are, the overview of the OSRA 2022 final rule. Who does it affect? What are the material changes in the rule? How does it impact you and the different parties? We'll also come out with an action plan in practical terms, and then how can visibility solutions potentially help you? And Q&A is an ongoing thing, but we'll leave some time at the end to answer more questions. All right, so who we are. As I said, I'm the CEO of Terminal49. Terminal49 has been in the business for over 5 years. We help the greater supply chain industry, BCOs, logistics service providers, automatically track containers and manage containers at risk. And we do this by pulling data from various different sources. We can track containers globally across all major ocean carriers, over 98% of the cargo movements globally. We are connected to every single terminal and now rail in the United States and Canada and Mexico. So providing that critical inbound and outbound visibility on what's happening at the terminals all the way to your final destination over rail. And this really helps with the fact, one is you don't have to manually track containers. Everybody in your organizations is in the know what is happening with their shipping containers, what to do next. And more importantly, you can effectively plan and mitigate exceptions, demurrage, and per-diem, amongst others, effectively communicate this data within your organization, effectively communicate and work with your partners through Terminal49. I'm going to hand it over to Dan.
Thank you, Akshay. Greetings, everybody. And a special thank you to Christy for helping to organize this entire event. Its promotion, the turnout, over 300 people signed up. Not everybody can make it the day of the live event. Of course, we have the recording, but great work done by Christy there. And always a pleasure to work with Terminal49. So very quickly, and this is only one slide. Trade Accelerators, co-founder, my partner's name is Spencer Strader. We're a tech-enabled freight forwarder and customs broker and a licensed VOCC. So we have skin in the game when it comes to demurrage and detention. The company was founded in 2021, but it was not a startup. It was actually a carve-out of an existing business that was the customs brokerage division of another company. So all of the people came over. So important to point out that it's not a startup. International air freight, ocean freight, customs brokerage. I'm in LA, Long Beach, offices in Miami, New York, New Jersey, Denver, San Juan, Puerto Rico, global network, all that good stuff. And that's essentially what we do. So the point being, we have some perspective on demurrage and detention. We've historically had skin in the game when it comes to demurrage and detention, and have some insights that we'd like to share with you folks today.
Thanks, Dan. And I'll drive the conversation, but Dan's been in the business for a long time. We both are logistic nerds, and I'm still a logistic nerd in the making. And Dan, I think, is a full-blown logistics nerd. We get excited about these things, but it's really important to get on the same page as an industry. And this is why we're here today. Let's talk about the ruling. We'll start with a brief poll. Like, how familiar are you with this OSRA 22 final rule? This has been a couple years in the making, but a lot more information has been coming out over the last couple months as this rule solidifies. And what does it actually mean? How does it impact people? So we're curious where you are as your understanding of this rule. This poll should be coming out. What is the OSRA 22 final rule? This was issued. The rule as a draft has been in the making for the last couple of years, and the final rule came out a couple months ago. And really, the rule deals with the invoicing requirements and the specificity around the invoicing requirements as it pertains to demurrage and detention invoices. This means, who are the parties that are being invoiced? What is the timing and the billing process for the invoice? What should be in the invoice? How should you pay the invoice? And how does it affect different parties? What are the changes from before, where there were guidelines? So in many ways, this is not new. There have always been guidelines around invoicing, but there are now federal rules around being very specific around the requirements related to the demurrage and detention invoice. Dan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think this is coming close to the culmination of what really started going back to 2018. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but where BCOs felt that, especially as it relates to demurrage and detention, that they were being taken advantage of. I don't know how else to phrase that, by the carriers and or marine terminal operators, and demurrage and detention was being treated as a revenue source by the carriers. So there was an original uprising, if you will, going back several years, the result of which was OSRA 2022, which went into play in June of that year. And this final rule finally brings some definition, not all, and we'll point out what's missing, but some final definition around requirements and especially timing. So the message of this entire webinar is, whether you're a BCO, a beneficial cargo owner, an importer, an NVOCC, ocean freight forwarder, definitely a drayage provider, if you don't have a plan in place and how you're going to operate within your ecosystem, depending on whether you're a shipper or an NVO, as we said, you need to get one quick, because this stuff goes into play on the 28th. And we'll be pointing out those things as we go through the webinar.
Yeah. And to Dan's point, before this ruling, there was no standard process around who should be billed. Dray carriers were getting invoices for per-diem. LSPs were getting invoices and fronted the bill. Dray carriers were fronting the bill. That created a little bit of distrust and a lot of friction between the parties. There was no standardized process around the justification of charges, and that's still, a little bit of that is still up in the air. There was no standard billing process, like when should an invoice, people were getting invoices months and sometimes years after a charge was accrued. There were no clear, while a dispute process has existed, there's a very specific criteria around the disputes process and the billing process. And the most important thing is, cargo owners felt that there were unjust billing practices that were heightened by significant fees charged and collected by ocean carriers. At the end of the day, they were making those charges, but it created friction and mistrust between their direct vendors, which were many times cargo owners and dray providers. And so that's what this new ruling is trying to address. But there are still a few unknowns here and some difficulties in how to validate these charges, which comes down to the lack of data and visibility to support an audit, and then finally a dispute process. And Dan, maybe you want to expand on what was the situation before OSRA 2020?
Yeah, it's a free-for-all, to be honest. But interesting to note on the poll that 12% of the respondees said they were good to go, feeling very comfortable about what they need to know and, more importantly, what they need to do. As of the 28th, 37% came back not too familiar at all. So that's the spirit of this webinar is to heighten people's awareness and maybe even generate more questions than answers, as we had discussed, because it was a free for all prior to OSRA 2022. Bearing in mind that the steamship lines for the longest time before COVID hit, when rates were going up to $25,000 for a 40-footer out of Shenzhen to LA Long Beach, they were losing billions, big time money. So it's somewhat understandable, emphasis on somewhat, that they, being the carriers, were looking for revenue opportunities, albeit through demurrage and detention. And that was really the genesis of this whole conversation, this feeling that BCOs were being taken advantage of. The other point I'll make before we move on, and we will elaborate upon this, and I think everybody online is familiar with this practice, is that the NVO, sometimes drayage provider, sometimes customs broker, working on behalf of an import BCO, would front the money for demurrage and detention, especially demurrage, because the carriers wouldn't release a container until all demurrage was paid. And then that third party, the NVO, the dray provider, customs broker, would invoice the BCO. Then the BCO would conveniently say, no, we don't agree with that. We're not paying. So I know, coming from freight forwarding and customs brokerage, I can tell you stories in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, some in the millions, that third-party service providers fronted the money on behalf of BCOs and never collected. So there's benefits to the BCO here, and selfishly, as an NVOCC myself, there's benefits to the logistics community as well.
Absolutely. So speaking of which, how does it affect you? You being cargo owners, logistics service providers, freight forwarders, customs brokers, dray carriers, and of course, NVOCCs, marine traffic operators. So the material difference now is on the invoice, the bill to party is the BCO. And there is an established billing process, which will go into the 30-day rule shortly. The carriers can't just invoice the dray carriers for a per diem and block them from picking up more loads if they don't pay the invoice. That was, again, causing a lot of friction. So the invoice obligation is to the cargo owner, and they can't hold a trucking carrier responsible or have financial obligation. Now, this doesn't mean as a cargo owner, you can't have your partners, whether it's a dray carrier or a logistics service provider, you could ask them to pay for it. And then that's a discussion between you and your partners, but the obligation is directly to the cargo owner. And from a 30-30-30 rule, we'll go into the timing of the process is of material changes. And from our logistics service providers, they now know who clear sense of responsibility, billing responsibilities, right? The dray carriers and LSPs know that the bill to party here is first the cargo owner, right? This could reduce the administrative overhead upfront on LSPs. Dan will talk about the caveat being NVOCC, but for the greater ecosystem, the obligation now and the overhead is on the BCO. This will speed up the whole process. It does have trade-offs. The invoicing process will start shortly, 30 days within the accrued charges for D&D, but that also means there's more financial obligation upfront to pay these invoices. And that's been, these invoices been outstanding for a long time, and the cash has been fronted by some parties, and BCOs have not been paying. So there is some financial upfront headaches / cash flows that might be affected. But ultimately, I think this will bring more clarity to the whole process, who is involved, what their responsibilities are. And then MTOs, the marine terminal operators, have to comply with the process, even if they are issuing invoices, right? Anything else that you want to add, Dan?
Yeah, I think the obvious point here is the timing component, because they're very specific. And as Akshay said, he'll go into this in just one second. But if you think back, and I have contacts with BCOs outside of my business with Trade Accelerators, so I get some good data points. But I know of BCOs, substantial BCOs, that are still being sent invoices for demurrage and detention by ocean carriers from 2022. So the delay that has gone on historically, I think there's going to be a shock to the overall system with what Akshay is going to talk about now and this 30-30-30 rule, because as the name would indicate, the amount of time that parties have to build, dispute, and settle is very defined and much shorter than what's been experienced in the past, because there was no fixed timeline in the past. So this is one of the major themes of the entire presentation is you, especially if you're a BCO, you have to be aligned by process and by timing. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck with bills that may not be valid. So with that, that's a good segue for you, Akshay.
Yeah. So this is, if anything you get out of this presentation is what are your action items? Like you're going to get billed if you're a cargo owner, and then what is the process around billing? So the 30-30-30 rule relates to three things. One is issuing of invoices. And the material specificity over there is the billing party, which is the carrier, vessel operating ocean carrier, and the marine terminal operators must issue demurrage and detention invoice within 30 days after the charges stop accruing. So the last charge, right? Because usually will be per diem if that's the case. If there's no per diem, that will be DMD. And they have 30 days to give you an invoice. Then, in terms of responding from the invoice date, the party receiving the invoice, which is going to be the cargo owner or NVOCC, if they're the first party in line, they have 30 days to respond to that invoice. And generally, the suggestion here is the dispute process, quote unquote dispute process, or if you're unhappy with the invoice or you need to pay the invoice, you want to do that in the 30-day period from the invoice date. And then the final 30 days, once there is a response from the cargo owner to the carrier, you have 30 days to resolve the dispute, unless both you, the carrier, and the cargo owner have aligned on you need more time to dispute. So the last 30 is flexible as long as both parties have agreed on extension of the resolution of that invoice. And so we have a chart here or a graphic here, container discharges. Demurrage can start happening based on how much free time you have. Standard free time of 4 or 5 days for most carriers. That could be a custom contract that you have with your carrier or NVOCC. So keeping that in mind, what is that? And so tracking those dates of availability, gate out, that's what becomes critical here. How much tariff that you have to pay. And then for per diem, when the empty out happens, then the clock starts ticking for how many days you have a free time of storage of detention before per diem charges go into effect. And that's when the clock starts ticking, and then so on and so forth.
You have a couple questions that are coming in, Akshay. We might want to maybe jump on a couple of them so we don't get a big pile.
Yeah, let's take some questions. How do you show you had an agreement to extend? We're actually going to go into this shortly, but let's talk about that in terms of the compliance and dispute in practical terms. I'm going to go forward a little bit here. I think at the upfront, you want to start documenting your contract terms and tariffs with your carriers and NVOCC, right? So from a practical standpoint, document before you can even dispute or challenge an invoice, what are the terms that you have? And that's how, on the term side, if you disagree that like your terms that you had is not what the invoice states, that's, your documentation, your contracts is going to be important to have in front of you. Another question is, as an ocean freight forwarder on the import side, we're not acting as an NVOCC. One line has issued an email this morning that they will invoice the consignee. What are you interpreting that as? Do you have access to the actual BCO? And these are not on our contracts. What's your take on that, Dan?
Yeah, this is consistent with the rule. So as Akshay pointed out, the BCO has to be billed. So the one line issued an email that they will invoice the consignee. So that's correct. Do they have access to the actual BCOs? And these are not on our contract. So you're an ocean forwarder, in this instance, not acting as an NVOCC. So by definition, the beneficial cargo owner either has a contract with the steamship line or they're getting spot rates. So by definition, and this brings up we don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole here, but think about this because these are the practical considerations. If a BCO had always used a drayage provider to front the money for demurrage and detention, and never had an accounts payable relationship with the steamship line. And now that the bill's going to show up on May 28th for this shipment, something as impractical as never having set up a carrier as a vendor, at least for those types of charges, this becomes a challenge. But in terms of what's being said here and being done, that is consistent with the letter of the law. And OSRA 2022 is a law.
And in terms of DDP shipments, when the seller has the full obligation from end to end, Dan, what is the consideration there?
Yeah, so we might need a little clarification on this. If we're talking about an import or an export, because most of our orientation is on the import side, but OSRA 2022 applies to exports as well. So let's assume for the sake of conversation that this is an import shipment, which by definition means that the seller overseas, the factory overseas, is paying for all freight charges, including customs duties, DDP up to the named point at destination. So we'll operate on that assumption. But again, this person could be talking about an export shipment, but let's say it's an import. So with that said, in the case of a DDP shipment, where the importer is the shipper, they wouldn't be the shipper. The factory would be the shipper. They would be the beneficial cargo owner. That's a nuanced change there. But is it possible to have the steamship line bill them for any incurred charges? Them meaning the seller overseas, because they're the ones that signed up for DDP. Now, in practical terms, my answer to that would be no, because you could certainly, a steamship line could certainly send a bill to the factory overseas, but the factory overseas is going to say, even if it was a DDP shipment and they're technically responsible for those charges, going to try to dodge those charges, because this was going on with DDP shipments long before OSRA came along. So technically, the seller overseas can be billed under a DDP Incoterm because that's their responsibility. But in a practical world, good luck collecting that money.
Yeah, and I would say this is where the conversation is important to establish these rules of engagement. On a freight forwarder side, you should notify your consignee that, by the way, these things can happen. You make sure you communicate this with the sellers, who is responsible for this invoice. And that gets fuzzy, right? Because it could be that the consignee didn't have space at their warehouse to accept the shipment, and there is a reason for a detention charge or a demurrage charge. So it gets a little fuzzy, but I think nonetheless, a conversation is important for DDP shipments to see who's going to do what and what are the rules of engagement here. So is the effective date for a date of invoice or date of interchange from rail port? So I think there's a nuance here. If the gate out happens at the port of the full out is going to happen at the port of discharge, the receiving party is going to be a dray carrier. Any demurrage and per diem will incur to the receiving party, in this case, the consignee or the beneficial cargo owner. If it's going over rail, that there's demurrage between the port of discharge and the rail carriers, that demurrages to the rail carrier. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, over here. Now, there are some carve outs here in the obligation to rail carriers. Dan, do you have a input over here? Because I think they were rail carriers.
Yeah, rail's not part of it. That's for sure. But to answer there's this question here, the effective date for date of invoice. So the bill coming from the carrier or MTO is within 30 days of the last instance of the charge, where demurrage would have ended, where detention would have ended. Then the BCO has 30 days from the date of the carrier's invoice to respond. And we probably should have said this at the front end, that you can just Google a lot of this stuff. Final rule, it'll take you to the FMC website where you can go straight to the source and see all this stuff. Factual statements that we're making here are based on what's in the Federal Register, what's in the final rule, etc. So that's the answer to that one. The other one, and we can move on from here. There's another one I want to comment too. One is, I'm assuming disputes be online with most steamship lines, typically by email. Always want to get everything in writing, but the answer to that question is it depends. If you have if it's an ocean carrier contract, by definition includes free time for demurrage and detention. The answer to that question is yes. If the contract is with an NVOCC, it will be with them. The other point that we'll talk about and won't elaborate on now is what about spot quotes and how does that all work? Because the free time associated with spot quotes is typically much lower than what you'd get in a contract. But we'll elaborate on that in just a Someone commented, carriers do not consider Incoterms, purely operate under the bill of lading terms and conditions. I would have to respectfully, adamantly disagree with that statement because Incoterms, among other things, determine who pays for what, as in is the freight prepaid under a DDP import, or is it freight collect to an importer under free carrier port of Shenzhen? That's the Incoterms matter to everybody. That's unequivocal. Can you repeat this example, please? This is important. Which example are we? Which one are we?
Yeah, we'll come back to the question, Bonnie, if you can be specific. Okay, contract versus NVOCC versus spot. Okay, perfect. We're going to come back to this because this is something we're going to talk about, things to consider shortly. Before we get there, let's just to talk about compliance and dispute process in practical terms. So the first thing to note here is adhere to the timeline and build an SOP within your process that once you get an invoice is it compliant, right? In order for you to audit the invoice, you need to create a document which should have your contract terms with the carrier and or the NVOCC, right? What are the tariffs? How much last free day you have for demurrage? How much last free day you have per diem? Is it standard? Is it contracted per carrier, per NVOCC? And the bigger you are, the more lanes you have, the more you have to document here as a starting point for the audit process. And in terms of the dispute, I think just want to clarify here, FMC suggests just resolve your situation, resolve your conflicts before you get to an FMC. And the carriers also want that, right? Carriers do not want these disputes to go to FMC. And so they are willing to resolve these conflicts with facts in front of you. And that's, I think, the key term is the facts in front of you with the carrier and or the NVOCC first before you escalate it with FMC. Anything you want to comment on, Dan, over there?
No, I think that's good.
And
I'm getting all excited. I'm sorry for interrupting. I'm getting all excited about getting back to these questions here. I'm reading and listening to you, and it's turning into something I think helpful for people. So
perfect.
This is
well,
good.
Let's get to that as soon as we're going to launch another poll, which is related. And what is your confidence in having the data needed to dispute? That should be coming in. And I'm going to jump right in because I think this is what the meat of the conversation is. Let's talk about things to consider. Danny, still here?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Let's answer Bonnie's question because I think there are nuances here in carrier versus NVOCC versus spot. Dan, do you want to comment?
Yeah, that was one of the questions, actually. So thank you for that person for coming back in. So let's think about this again from an importer perspective. So in terms of, and it's contract season, so it's relevant. So there's contracts directly with the carriers, which again, by definition, are going to have free time for demurrage, detention, et cetera. You could be an importer coming into one port. You could be an importer coming into multiple ports. You could be an importer that brings in dry containers and or refrigerated containers where the free time for reefer containers is typically less. So these are important considerations. So you have the ocean contract. You have an NVOCC contract where essentially you as the beneficial cargo owner, the importer, aren't negotiating with the steamship line. You're negotiating with a freight forwarder who in turn has contracts with the steamship lines. Or, and this is where I think it gets really interesting, what about spot rates? Where I'm an importer and I go online and I'm shopping some rates around. I have containers coming out of the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, some out of Asia, et cetera. I get a spot rate, but what's the demurrage and detention free time going to be on that spot rate? Because I can almost guarantee you that it's going to be less than anything under an ocean contract or an NVOCC contract. So that's the clarification that I believe that the person who had written in before was asking for. So they have to be in there anyway, the demurrage and detention free time in both an ocean carrier and an NVOCC contract. But one thing you might do, if you haven't finished up your contracts just yet, in either instance, in the contract, I have an explicit statement that the terms around demurrage and detention are subject to OSRA 2022 rules. Everybody knows that. It's not a requirement, but it's good to have that in your contract. If you have a standard operating procedure that you put in place with a carrier, an NVO, a drayage provider, put it in there as well. So everybody knows from the get-go what the story is going to be. But that spot rate thing is important because I'm sure folks online have been reading up on this as well. Contract season historically would have been done by now. Contract season being the negotiation of space on ships between BCOs, carriers, NVOs, et cetera. It seems like it's taking a little longer. What is clearly out there, and this is not proprietary information. You can put a vector on this with 3 phone calls to a couple of your freight forwarding friends, is that the steamship lines, of course, they wrap up their negotiations with the big importers first, and whatever's left over space-wise, they'll negotiate with the NVOCCs, and whatever's left over after that goes to spot. Well, the steamship lines, common knowledge, not proprietary information, I'll use the term, they're manipulating supply. They're not allocating enough space to NVOs in the hopes that the spot market will be much higher. Now, that's a strategic decision. It's all above board, perfectly legal, and what have you. The question to a BCO who can't get a contract with an NVOCC because the NVOCC already committed all of their space to somebody else. Now you're in the spot market. What does this mean to you from a free time perspective for demurrage and detention? Because I can guarantee you it will be different and it will be less than what you would get under an NVO or a carrier contract. That's a long answer to a short question, but it's important and relevant from a timing perspective.
Yeah. And these contracts can be lengthy. So ask them to clarify what are the D&D tariffs and what are the D&D free time allotted for the spot contracts. And I don't think it's unique to spot. It's like for any contract that you have. So you have it up front because once you get these, I'll give you an example of an invoice that invoice should have details around the free time, the start and end dates. Currently does not have what your contract says. So you're going to have to refer to another document. And just to speak about, let's jump into the invoice requirements. So now in the rule, there is a section that says they have drafted what are the requirements and the attributes, the 13 pieces of information that need to be the invoice. That requirement is delayed, right? And so the carrier is not technically today on 28 obligated to report on all of these. Based on my cursory look, many of these pieces are on the invoice, right? Of course, like who is being billed to. Date of container availability is not necessarily on the invoice. Port of discharge should be the invoice. Container numbers, of course. ERDs for exports might or might not be in the invoice. How much free time is allowed might not be the invoice. Start and end date of free time is probably not in the invoice. Applicable rules and the daily rate is not necessarily in the invoice today based on what I've seen. Of course, contract information is there. And I think to Dan's point, the compliance statement confirming the charges must comply FMC rules and regulation, that should be obvious because now there is a federal rule. The T&Cs can't overrule a federal rule, but you want to make sure that we are on the same page with your carrier. And lastly, the carrier performance statement is supposed to be on the invoice, but it's not. And why I'm bringing this all up is while this is not in a requirement today, you should use this as a hint and a guideline to help you with an audit and dispute process, which means you should figure out with partnering with your freight forwarder, NVOC, dray carriers, and or visibility tools, can you procure all of this information so you have it in hand when you need to resolve a conflict or dispute with FMC, because this is going to be important for you to have at your fingertips. And just briefly going back to, we've covered this, but the 404 areas in building a standard operating procedure is document your contract terms and tariffs, document payment process. Each carrier, some have online, some have mailed them a check, identify if you do need to pay this invoice, how do you pay them? We've talked about the invoicing requirements, but really spot checking, do you have a compliant invoice today? And then document how are you going to audit and dispute an invoice with the carrier. Dan covered the spot contracts. Anything else you would want to add, Dan, to this process and what we should do, what folks can do in a practical term?
Yeah, I think the overarching theme is don't treat this as business as usual, because it's not. Things are going to change. So whether it's your trade provider and VOCC that you work with, steamship line, you have to incorporate this stuff into some sort of a written document. Reference made to an NVO contract or an ocean carrier contract, but explicit, more importantly, probably in your standard operating procedures. And just to add a comment on the previous slide, because this has been a source of great confusion, and I've seen contradictory statements from parties regarding invoice requirements online after the final rule and its effective date came out. So I had mentioned this earlier, but I would urge folks to go on the FMC website. You can Google this stuff, OSRA 2022 final rule, go to the Federal Register. Sometimes it's better not to offer what appears to be an opinion or to get into a debate. So I was looking in preparation for this. Long story short, if you go to the Federal Register from the 26th of Feb, and this is just one sentence, but 540. So invoice requirements are under section 541.6 in the rule. So it says this final rule, and I'm reading it right off the FMC website, is effective on May 28th, 2024, except from such instruction 2, adding section 541.6 and instruction 3 under 541.99. We're not going to talk about that. The commission will publish a document in the Federal Register announcing the effective date of these amendments. So this is good stuff to have. It's good stuff to prepare now, because it's very likely there might be some slight iterations to invoice requirements. But most of what you see here is what's going to be in a subsequent final rule. So to get best practices in place, date of container availability, port of discharge, the free time component, etc., it's important anyway, whether it's part of the final rule or not. So just get into the habit. Now, from a practical perspective, and this is what I questioned from the get-go anyway, when this came out in June of 2022, the OSRA 2022, invoices are pretty busy already in terms of content. You saw some of the examples that Akshay put up. Where are these other 13 data points going to fit? It's just going to be impractical from an invoice perspective and how busy that invoice becomes. But the message is start getting these things in place now. So when the subsequent final rule comes down on this stuff, maybe they change a couple things, but most of it is going to be the same. So start getting into that habit now. And it's only going to be to your benefit anyway. The more detail you can have, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, there was one question asked by Tanner: can Trade carriers still pay demurrage from terminal operators on behalf of BCO? Absolutely. Anybody can pay and I actually have a follow-up question to that, Dan. Demurrage can incur, and the terminal can prevent you from picking up the container, even with this ruling. And you have to pay the...
Yeah. Where is that one? I'm scrolling down. I saw the one on can the Trade carrier still pay? I see that one.
Yeah, I'm asking that question actually to follow.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So this, to me, it's a little bit of a gray area, to be honest, because you know the drill on demurrage. You can only, and again, I live and work right next to LA Long Beach. So I'm used to the appointment system, 12 terminals, 13 terminals, all different appointment systems, etc. And LA Long Beach and other places too. It's a euphemism, but you can't get an appointment until a container is available. And of course, that means it's cleared through customs and all that good stuff. What it really means is that all the charges have been paid. If there's $2,000 in demurrage, which is a lot in this day and age, there's not that much congestion, but pick a number, $1,500. It's very likely that the payment's going to be made before that container is picked up, and that this is more applicable, this rule, in the practical real world for detention. Because think of a container that for whatever circumstance has both demurrage on the full gate out. I'm talking an import container now. And then the BCO hangs onto it for 20 days, and then there's detention. So how does that invoice work and the whole 30-day thing go? So again, these are practical questions. This is one of those scenarios where I think we're generating more questions than answers. I think it's going to come down, although the law applies equally around the country. You'll see different applications and practices of the trade emerge between an Oakland versus a LA Long Beach versus a New York, New Jersey versus a Savannah. We just have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, there's a couple of related questions. One was,
Yeah, there's a couple of good ones here. We can run through these quickly if you want.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's see here. And I'll just use first names. Some are anonymous. And thank you to everybody for writing in. So let's start. Let's see here.
Yeah, has FMC confirmed how long the invoice requirements for carriers have been delayed?
No. Short answer to that is no.
Are there tools that can calculate free time easily for BCOs? And I think the related question was, how do you know the start? How do you know the start and stop of availability? So this is where visibility tools come into play. It's very hard problem to solve, right? As a matter of fact, like if you go on a terminal website and put in a container number, you're getting the last status of that container. Many terminals are not providing you when it started becoming available. Availability can start and stop, right? As we know, availability depends on if the container could be in a closed area. That's unfair. Availability can depend on if the terminal is not functioning, is like on vacation, or it's not operational, then that should not count towards free time. If there is no appointments available for pickup, is that fair? This is where a tool like Terminal49 and other tools can help, where we are constantly monitoring the status of a container and building an audit trail of the status changes, availability and not available, last free day changes. And you are going to need those tools, even if the invoice requirement is going to affect, because either you take the carrier on their word or you have your own data to prove against the carrier. So it's not one answer here. You need a combination of data to really come up with your own collateral to prove against, to validate or invalidate an invoice. And leaning on visibility tools is my kind of go-to answer over there. And this is why we exist as a business. If the charges were incurred prior to 528, but invoices invoiced after 528, do the new rules apply based on the bill dates or invoice dates? Good question. I want to say over here, and don't quote me on this, I think the billing requirements will go into effect after May 28. And so the last accrued charge after that date is when the requirements will go into effect. Carriers often invoice using master bill of lading number, not invoice numbers. What things getting disputed do you recommend only paying on invoice numbers, and how can you force carriers to provide invoice? So this is, I think, as soon as it's going to be a case by case basis, right? Carriers are also going to build their own processes and how they handle this on a case by case basis. So you want to ask this question upfront to the carrier. There are no clear rules of engagement around invoice number and what part of the invoice to pay that's set by FMC based on. Let's come back to some of the questions. We have about 10 minutes left. I just want to finish our deck and then we'll leave about 6-7 minutes at the end for more questions. I want to ask another poll, and this comes to a lot of the questions that are in there. What support are you looking for as it pertains to the rule, right? This is a moving target. A lot of things are still up in the air. Carriers, freight forwarders are looking to provide answers to their customers. Cargo owners are looking for answers and help. And we want to know where freight forwarders can help you and we can help you. And I want to just bring it back briefly to the invoice rule requirements, right? Even though this requirement is not into effect, there is material information that can help you audit these invoices. You want to rely here not just on a visibility provider, but your partners. A lot of freight forwarders today, including TXC and other freight forwarders, they have their own visibility solutions. Are they able to provide you those milestones? How much availability do you have? What is the actual last free day for Demurrage? What is the last free day for per-diem? Was there an appointment available, and so on and so forth? So this is where importance of data in this day and age is critical, whether you get it from a company like Terminal49 or your partner. And the validity of data and the quality of data is very critical for you to hold your vendors accountable, ocean carriers in this case, right? And not to say that having data at your fingertips helps you run your business a lot more efficiently. All right, let's spend the last 8 minutes on more questions. I'm a shipper. If CSEE has demurrage and detention related to their delays, will a shipper be invoiced or CSEE, or this has had to be settled with the shipping line beforehand? What is CSEE?
Consignee.
Consignee. Okay.
Think.
Yeah, so I think this is similar to what Dan answered before. Consignee is going to be obligated. The cargo owner is obligated, even if the seller, if it's a DDP shipment. Now, the consignee could work with the seller, but the obligation is on the beneficial cargo owner. Is the MTO obligated to notify the D&D fees have begun to accrue or are accruing, or only obligated to send the invoices within 30 days? Based on what the current reality, yeah, I think if there is a demurrage, every single terminal that where the container makes it's not available for pickup, they are either obligated to provide it through their website or you have to call them. And most terminal operating systems do provide through a secondary or direct system what is the detention, what is the demurrage charges before you can pick up the container. Any comment over there, Dan, that you've noticed? Like anything that you would?
I don't think so.
Okay. If any party goes past 30-day time limit, what are the consequences for carrier and BCO? Good question. I would say it depends on the specific part, right? So the first 30 days, if you got an invoice much later than 30 days after the last accrued charge, 2 months after the ruling goes into effect, I would assume that you're not obligated to pay it because it does not meet the requirements of the ruling. Comment, Dan?
I was actually checking something else, Akshay, because people brought up the point about the invoice requirement going into effect on May 28th. And I was looking on the Federal Register. So just for clarification, and I believe I misspoke, and I apologize for that. That's section 541.6 as of May 14th is effective May 28th.
Which are the invoicing requirements?
That's right. 541.6.
So this
So
is
someone had pointed that out in the chat. I misspoke and I apologize for that. But so it's important to make that clarification as opposed to not to respond. So it came out on the 14th of May in the Federal Register. And those invoice requirements do go into effect on the 28th, as is.
and this is by Lori Felmer, right? The question that you're clarifying.
That is correct.
Yeah. So then that means is these are going to be requirements, which is of greater good to the cargo owners. So the carriers are going to be obligated to provide these milestones inside the invoice after 28th.
So there's a couple others here, and I know we're running out of time. My understanding is that if an invoice is received after the 30 days, the bill to party is not obligated to pay. That is correct. What if you attempt, polls coming up here, what if you attempt to dispute an invoice and the steamship line does not acknowledge or respond to your dispute? They have to. You don't have to pay if they don't, is the short answer, but you have to keep good records. And in your dispute, for example, if you couldn't return a container in time because you couldn't get an appointment, that the famous no appointments available, or a terminal isn't taking 20s or they're not taking 40s, whatever it is, you need screenshots of that stuff. And that's where sometimes your drayage provider can come in and assist in that, because oftentimes they're the ones that are organizing, not oftentimes, they are the ones that are organizing the return and such. So you have to keep a good record there. Dray carriers get shut out if they don't pay per diem bills. So no more shutout. Allegedly, and I'm curious how this will play out, as am I, because I think it's going to be different because of from port to port and even terminal to terminal in big ports like LA, Long Beach, and New York, New Jersey. It'll all come together because this is federal law. It's not optional. But I think in the early stages, you might see scenarios where somebody at a terminal is saying you can't have your container until the demurrage is paid. That wouldn't surprise me in the least. Yeah, I'm still fuzzy. This is from Larry. I'm still fuzzy on who is invoicing who. Will the steamship line invoice the consignee BCO directly for D&D? If it is under an ocean carrier contract or a spot rate from the ocean carrier, the answer is yes. If it's through an VOCC, and there's too much alphabet soup here, but the ocean carrier is going to invoice the OCC, and then the NVO has 30 days from the date of invoice from the underlying carrier to bill the BCO. So the long story short, if you have a contract with an ocean carrier, the bill's coming from them. If you have a contract with an VOCC, the bill's coming from them. If it's a spot rate off of a carrier website, the bill is going to come from them.
Yeah, and just to, I think everybody might be interested in the response to the poll 3, 30%, 50% of the people who answered would love to have a checklist on how to audit an invoice. About 30% of the people responded would like assistance with D&D dispute. 45% would like visibility solutions and or data to audit the invoice, and 23% said no support needed. So that's very interesting. This is a challenging situation to overcome. And what I'm hearing is everybody would like, or at least half the people would like some kind of support. And this is not the last webinar we're going to do. We wanted to focus on an FYI here. We already doing it live, but we learned something new as this thing is changing very quickly. But we are just getting started in providing more assistance, more knowledge, more education to and participate with the community. And what does this mean and how does this impact everybody in the ecosystem? We have 1 more minute. Is the law retroactive?
No.
Thank you, everybody. We have some more questions. As promised, Dan and I will go and take these questions and including all the earlier questions and answer all of them and respond to the email, including the recording of this conversation. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you again, Dan, for participating in the webinar with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And thanks everyone to chipping in and making it a better presentation.
Have a great one, everybody.